Derek Jackson was a 19-year-old college student with aspirations of a brighter future, dreaming of becoming a sociologist to dismantle the societal barriers affecting marginalized individuals like himself. A promising black youth studying sociology at a prestigious university in contemporary America, Derek had committed to a life of rigorous study and advocacy, aiming to illuminate the inequities plaguing his community. Little did he know that he would soon encounter those very injustices he sought to analyze and combat. On a crisp autumn morning, as leaves crunched beneath his feet and a chill lingered in the air, Derek's life was thrust into chaos. Accused of drug possession, an allegation he vehemently denied, his once bright path devolved into a tumultuous legal battle. Facing a courtroom steeped in systemic racism, where the scales of justice often tipped against people of color, Derek's future loomed uncertain. Each step toward the courthouse felt like traversing an invisible minefield, each heartbeat resonating with a blend of fear and determination as he braced himself for a fight for not only his freedom, but also against societal narrative long written without his voice, a narrative that shaped perceptions and outcomes for countless others in similar situations. As he entered the courthouse, the towering walls seemed to close in, amplifying the anxiety bubbling beneath his calm exterior. Derek positioned himself in the oversized waiting area, surrounded by a kaleidoscope of emotions from other defendants and their families. Each face told a story of struggle, resilience, or defeat, an echo of human experience reverberating throughout the halls of justice. He couldn't shake the feeling that their journeys were intertwined with his, echoing the same fears and hopes that had initially motivated him to pursue sociology. A realization washed over him. This was not merely about his individual case, but rather a microcosm of the systemic issues he studied. A twinge of courage ignited within him. Derek had always wanted to be a voice for the voiceless, and now he was stepping into a role he had never anticipated, the living example of how justice was often denied to those who looked like him. His lawyer, a seasoned advocate with a reputation for fighting the good fight, arrived with a reassuring nod and a briefcase filled with evidence. "We will not let them silence you," she said firmly, her eyes gleaming with determination. Derek felt a sense of trust in her presence, even as the weight of the world pressed heavily on his shoulders. With each passing moment, he prepared himself mentally for the arguments that would unfold, knowing they would not only shape his future, but also reflect the broader societal dynamics at play. The court proceedings commenced, rife with the tension of unspoken judgments. As the prosecution painted Derek as a stereotype, his heart raced. Yet he steeled himself, drawing strength from the knowledge that across the nation, countless others were enduring similar trials. He envisioned his studies in sociology, the countless hours spent analyzing the work of scholars like Michelle Alexander, whose book The New Jim Crow dissected the intersections of race, class, and the criminal justice system with startling clarity. He recalled the names of activists such as Angela Davis and Bryan Stevenson, whose legacies loomed large in his mind, their stories igniting a passion within him to fight back against the very system that was now threatening his future. During the testimonies, Derek's hope flickered as he listened to expert witnesses who had dedicated their lives to exposing the biases entrenched within the system. Each fact they presented resonated deeply, urging him to harness the experiences of this tumultuous challenge. He realized that if he could somehow transform this ordeal into an opportunity for dialogue, he might illuminate the existence of an issue that was far too often brushed under the rug, a beacon of hope amidst despair. As the trial wore on, the public began to take notice. Social media platforms erupted with discussions surrounding Derek's case, turning it into a broader conversation about racial profiling and the need for reform within the justice system. Derek found himself becoming a symbol, a rallying point for advocates and allies standing against injustice. Every post shared online filled him with both pride and trepidation, but it also reminded him of the responsibility he bore, not just for himself, but for those adults and youth navigating the same treacherous waters. As the gavel signaled recess, Derek stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, feeling both the world's weight on his shoulders and the spark of numerous voices pushing him forward. He thought of his mother, who had instilled in him values of perseverance and integrity. His future still unfinished and waiting to be written flashed through his mind. With each step back into the courthouse, he realized that regardless of the verdict, This journey would define him and fuel the fire of change he intended to ignite. More than just a sociology student, he was now a living testament to the fight for justice, a fight he was determined to face head-on. The atmosphere inside the courthouse was heavy with an almost palpable tension, a thick fog of anticipation and anxiety that enveloped everyone present. The polished marble floors and ornate columns, which had once stood as grand testaments to the ideals of law and order, now seemed to radiate a cold indifference to the profound struggles of a young black man. As Derek entered the colossal structure, his head held high and his heart pounding with fierce determination, he was acutely aware of the stark contrast between his resolve and the scrutinizing eyes of the predominantly white audience and jury. These figures, seated in judgment, represented a lifetime of privilege that had shaped their perceptions of race and justice, their gazes heavy with unspoken biases. In this moment, the courthouse transformed into a modern-day stage, a battleground where ideals of blind justice were touted with fervor. Yet the reality spoke differently to Derek, a truth that resonated deeply within him and ignited an unwavering resolve to expose the cracks in a system that often failed those who looked like him. As the judge took her seat, the gavel resonated through the air, echoing like a heartbeat, announcing the start of the proceedings. Derek's breathing quickened, synchronized with the rhythmic sound, each thump a reminder of the stakes at play. His family seated in the back offered silent support, their faces etched with worry, yet glimmering with hope. He could feel their eyes full of unyielding love, urging him to stand firm against the tidal wave of doubt that threatened to engulf him. In the front row, the prosecuting attorney, a well-groomed man in a crisp suit, began his opening statement with a practiced smile that turned his words into a weapon, aimed directly at Derek's character. The man spoke of criminality and threat as if they were qualities sewn into Derek's very being, labeling him a stereotype formed by years of societal narrative. Derek's mind raced as he recalled the long nights spent studying law, the conversations with mentors who had fought battles similar to his own. Yet as the attorney continued, Derek felt the walls closing in, the weight of the room pressing against him, each bias a chain anchoring him to a past he refused to accept. But then from the corner of his vision, he noticed a young woman, an intern he had spoken with during his brief visit to the lawyer's office. She was diligently taking notes, her eyes focused and intent. For the first time, Derek felt a flicker of hope amidst the suffocating pressure. Perhaps there were allies in this battle for truth, people who understood the complexity of his experience, a tapestry woven with both pain and resilience. As the defense attorney began her argument, Derek focused on her passionate plea for fairness and justice. She spoke with conviction, emphasizing that the case against Derek was fraught with inconsistencies and deeply flawed logic. Each word unfurled a narrative that countered the prosecution's claims, painting him not as a villain, but as a young man with dreams, a life yet to be lived. Derek felt a resurgence of strength, reminiscent of the protests he had joined after unspeakable injustices had rattled their community. Moments when chants for justice echoed through the streets, demanding not merely justice, but a reckoning of an entire system failing its citizens. Outside, the sky began to darken, casting long shadows across the courthouse grounds, mirroring the complexity of the very system meant to uphold justice. Derek couldn't help but wonder if the storm brewing above would mirror the chaos swirling in the courtroom. As the testimonies unfolded, the atmosphere inside morphed into a swirling storm of emotions. Anger, disbelief, and even fleeting moments of solidarity surfaced within the courtroom walls. As Derek took a deep breath, he felt an unshakable connection to the generations before him. Their stories of struggle and triumph filled his heart, reminding him that he was not alone. Whatever the verdict might be, he was a part of something larger, a movement toward change, a voice rising in harmony with others, refusing to be silenced. It was in this realization that Derek discovered not just the desire to fight for his innocence, but the determination to stand as a beacon of hope for those who followed. In that moment, the courthouse transformed once more, no longer just a site of judgment, but a crucible for justice, equity, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The trial was set to be presided over by Judge William Harrington, a man in his late 50s whose wisdom and experience were often matched only by his stringent adherence to established legal procedures. Renowned for his fair yet unyielding approach, Judge Harrington had earned a reputation as a formidable presence in the courtroom, one who believed that the law should be as impartial as the scales of justice themselves. However, beneath this veneer of objectivity lay the complexities of his own upbringing. Having grown up in a world insulated by privilege, he often found it challenging to fully comprehend the nuances of cases steeped in racial disparity. The courtroom, a stately room adorned with dark wood paneling and heavy curtains, exuded an air of solemnity that seemed almost tangible. It was filled mostly with white jurors, men and women whose perceptions of race and justice had been molded through the lens of their own life experiences, often insulated from the harsh realities faced by those like Derek. As they settled into their seats, a palpable division hung in the air, some jurors appearing disinterested, fiddling with their notepads or casting bored glances at the ceiling, while others whispered nervously among themselves, their hushed tones barely masking their apprehension. Yet they remained blissfully unaware of the weight their decisions would carry, not just for Derek, but for the very fabric of the community that filled the courtroom's tableau. The jurors' collective history, woven with unspoken biases and privileges, stood in stark contrast to Derek's own lived reality as a young black man caught in the intricate web of a judicial system seldom forgiving to those like him. Each decision they made could ripple outwards, influencing lives far beyond the walls of the stately room, echoing the silent struggles of countless individuals who had fought against an often unyielding system. Derek, with his heart pounding and eyes scanning the faces around him, was acutely aware of this disparity. It was not merely a trial, it was a battle for his identity, his future, and the chance to challenge an ingrained narrative that had long been written without his voice in the conversation. As the judge entered, a heavy gavel strike commanded silence, and Derek felt a lump form in his throat. The proceedings began, each word echoing off the courtroom walls, slowly dismantling the illusion of control he had attempted to maintain. Prosecutors lined up their evidence, each statistic and witness designed to paint him as a stereotype, a dangerous figure lurking in the shadows of a society reluctant to accept him. Derek's attorney, a weary but passionate advocate, stood ready to counter with the truth of Derek's life, a devoted son, a diligent worker, and a community member striving for equality in a world that often refused to acknowledge his right to exist fully. The tension thickened as the jurors were shown images of the incident that had brought them together, their faces mirroring the horror and confusion depicted on the screen. Derek's heart raced with each frame, knowing they were interpreting his reality through a lens that obscured empathy. He had always believed that a true discussion around justice involved listening to the stories wrapped within every statistic. Yet he also understood that the unexamined biases they carried were formidable opponents in their own right. Throughout the day, voices rose and fell, the rhythm of court deliberation evoking an emotional tide that threatened to pull him under. Derek's mind drifted to the countless conversations he had shared with friends and family about the very frameworks that built this courtroom, a system often designed to favor those who had never had to defend their humanity. He thought of his mother, who had taught him to stand tall even when the world seemed determined to knock him down, who had filled his ears with promises of hope and resilience that felt fragile in the face of such daunting odds. As the day wore on, signs of fatigue began to show on the jurors' faces, but Derek knew the fight was far from over. With each passing moment, he attempted to gather strength from the legacy of those who had fought before him. He remembered the names of activists and lawyers like Thurgood Marshall and Rosa Parks, who had, against all odds, ensured that their voices would resonate long after they were gone. He wanted to honor that legacy by standing firm, resilient in claiming his own narrative amid the clashing interpretations of truth that enveloped him. The stark realities of the injustices perpetuated against people of color and the need for societal change. Suddenly, the room shifted with the arrival of a prominent witness, a character who could tilt the scales in Derek's favor. As the witness began to recount their observations of the day in question, offering a perspective that challenged the harsh depiction of Derek, the atmosphere in the courtroom transformed. Murmurs erupted among the jurors, piercing through the heavy silence like a breath of fresh air. No longer merely passive observers, they began to engage with the nuances of the case, probing their own preconceptions as the tides of justice began to ripple under the weight of the truths. Through it all, Derek took a deep breath, feeling the flicker of hope in his chest, a small yet significant flame amidst the swirling shadows of uncertainty. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was not merely a battle prescribed by the law, with rigid statutes and cold arguments weighing heavily in the courtroom. Instead, it presented an extraordinary opportunity for transformation, not just for himself, but for everyone present. In this pivotal moment, each individual had the chance to confront deeply ingrained biases that had shaped their understanding of justice, morality, and humanity. With each exchange of words and ideas, there was the potential for a shift in perspective, an awakening that could ripple far beyond the cold confines of the courtroom. Derek envisioned a space where empathy flourished, a place where jurors could evolve into agents of change, and where the discussions seeded understanding, compassion, and perhaps even healing for a fractured community. This was more than a trial, it was a crossroads, a moment that could lead to greater awareness and a shared journey towards a more just society. Outside the windows, the vibrant colors of autumn painted the scene in hues of gold and crimson, transforming the mundane into a tapestry of vivid beauty. The leaves, once radiant with life and the promise of warmth, spiraled down gracefully from their branches, each one a poignant reminder of fleeting moments and lost opportunities. This seasonal shift symbolically echoed the fall of hope for many who dared to challenge the entrenched systems of injustice, their dreams swirling like the leaves in a gentle breeze. With each descending leaf, there came a silent reminder of burdens borne by those who have fought valiantly, but found themselves crushed under the relentless weight of societal expectations and ingrained prejudices. As they fell, the leaves whispered stories of resilience and struggle, of individuals whose voices had been stifled by the very fabric of the community that now watched in quiet contemplation. In this kaleidoscope of colors, the air was thick with the essence of change, and one could almost sense the underlying current of a restless yearning for justice, a drive pulsating quietly yet powerfully in the heart of the observing crowd. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched against the cobblestone streets, an unspoken tension wove through the crowd, manifesting in furrowed brows and clenched fists. Among the spectators stood a young woman named Alara, her dark hair catching the last glimmers of sunlight as she watched the leaves tumble. Each twist and turn of the foliage mirrored the thoughts racing through her mind. She felt an urgency building within her, one that was echoed in the whispers around her. Years of frustration, a cacophony of dissent brewing beneath the surface. She could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the city, a rhythm that spoke of resilience and the stubborn resistance against the tides of conformity. Ilara clenched the worn pamphlet in her hand, its edges frayed from countless readings. It contained the voices of those who had been silenced, a manifesto that challenged the status quo and called for a reckoning. As she stepped forward, drawn by an invisible thread of conviction, she could sense that her own dreams were intricately tied to the stories that fluttered down with the leaves, each one a call to action, a plea for recognition and change. A soft murmur began to rise as more people joined her, gradually building into a chorus of resolve. "We are here," someone shouted, their voice breaking through the rustling leaves. That simple proclamation ignited a spark among the crowd, transforming quiet contemplation into fervent determination. Eyes that were once cast downturned, now focused on the horizon, where the last light of day surrendered to the twilight. The air grew electric with anticipation, as if every inhalation charged the space between them, with hope, fueled by a shared belief that change was not only possible, but essential. Ilara felt a stirring deep within, a sense of belonging that wrapped around her like a warm cloak. She marveled at the sight of strangers turning into allies, of individual struggles converging into a united front. With each passing moment, the gathering coalesced around her, amplifying their collective voices to advocate for justice, to champion the dreams that had been buried under years of apathy and fear. The leaves continued to dance their spiraling waltz, a powerful metaphor for the chaos and beauty of change. The resolute chant, echoing off the walls of the buildings that had long overlooked the plight of its citizens, filled the air with purpose. This is just the beginning, Alara thought. She embraced the chill of the evening air, feeling an overwhelming sense of hope blossom within her. The vibrant shifts of autumn were not just a farewell to summer, but heralds of new beginnings, calling for hearts to awaken and minds to dare to dream anew. Together, they stood tall against the backdrop of falling leaves, ready to reclaim their narrative and pave the way for a future tinged not just with the gold and crimson of autumn, but with the brilliant colors of a more just society. Derek's defense attorney, Mrs. Laura Green, a seasoned lawyer renowned for her unwavering commitment to civil rights and social justice, was determined to navigate the murky waters of this case with tenacity and precision. Wester Naniman to one. The indictment asserted that Derek had been in possession of controlled substances, but Mrs. Green was not convinced that the evidence painted an accurate picture of reality. As she scrutinized the details, her frustration grew at the thought of how easily the system could disproportionately impact young people like Derek, kids who dared to dream and whose lives were thrown into chaos by biased policing techniques. She was acutely aware that the surveillance footage and testimonies presented by the prosecution could be tainted by an underlying current of discrimination, leading to criminal accusations that were more about who Derek was than what he had allegedly done. With every passing moment, Miss Green felt a deepening resolve to fight not just for Derek, but for the broader principles of equality and justice that were under siege. Mary Liast, Green's determination led her to delve deeper into Derek's background, connecting with his family and teachers who could vouch for his character. She arranged meetings with those who had witnessed his dedication to his studies and community service, believing that this tapestry of testimonials would help form a more complete narrative, one that showcased Derek not as a statistic, but as a young man filled with potential. Each conversation revealed a thread of common experiences shared among Derek's peers: the fear of being misjudged and the anxiety stemming from living in a society that often saw them as threats rather than assets. As she pieced together Derek's story, Miss Green also began to explore the systemic issues that had plagued the local community for generations. She reached out to grassroots organizations dedicated to reforming the very practices that led to Derek's situation. Collaborating with activists, she planned to incorporate their insights into her defense strategy, aiming to highlight how entrenched biases could warp perceptions of innocence. It was a crucial endeavor. Mrs. Green knew that if they could shine a light on the larger societal patterns at play, they might not only aid Derek's case, but also catalyze a broader conversation about justice reform. Her research revealed alarming statistics that showed disproportionate arrest rates for young people of color, further empowering her resolve to advocate for change. Each statistic was a reminder of the urgency of the fight ahead, the need to challenge perceptions and systemic injustices that turned innocent dreams into nightmares overnight. To bolster her case, she also enlisted the support of renowned experts in social justice and criminal law, reminding Mrs. Green of the importance of unity in the struggle for equality. As the court date loomed closer, Mrs. Green spent long nights preparing her argument, determined to dismantle the prosecution's assertion that Derek was guilty merely by virtue of his appearance. She crafted a narrative that intertwined Derek's aspirations with the grim realities of his predicament, tying in the heartfelt testimonies of those who believed in him. She was determined that the jury would see Derek not as just a defendant, but as a reflection of a community pushed to the margins, his story symbolic of a fight that extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The day of the trial arrived, and as Miss Green stood before the jury, she invoked the importance of empathy and understanding in their deliberation. She implored them to consider not only the evidence presented against Derek, but also the broader implications of their decision, how their verdict could signify whether change is possible in a world that often turns a blind eye to injustice. As she passionately spoke, she could sense the weight of hope within the room, the hope that together they might carve a different path forward, rooted in justice, equity, and recognition of the humanity in each individual, regardless of race or circumstance. During the arraignment, the air thickened with apprehension, a palpable tension enveloping the courtroom like a heavy fog. Each heart in the room seemed to beat in sync with the moment's weight, as if everyone understood the gravity of the unfolding proceedings. The prosecutor, Mr. Randall Coleman, known for his relentless courtroom approach, outlined the charges with a confidence bordering on arrogance, wielding his authority with ease, as if reveling in the spotlight. He cited multiple pieces of evidence, from meticulously prepared search warrants to damning surveillance footage portraying the events starkly. Yet beneath this legal presentation lay an undercurrent, an insinuation about Derek's character and background that was almost palpable. It felt as though Mr. Coleman was not merely presenting a case, but weaving a narrative designed to crystallize prejudices, painting Derek in broad strokes of guilt before the jury could even consider the facts. Across the aisle, Derek sat with his shoulders slumped, a stark contrast to the imposing figure of Mr. Coleman. Sarinim. His lawyer, Miss Emily Carter, leaned closer to him, whispering reassurances amidst the cacophony of accusations. Her voice, though low, held a steady resolve, attempting to bolster his fragile sense of composure as the weight of the prosecutor's words pressed down on him like a physical burden, twisting the knife of anxiety into his heart. "Stay focused, Derek. We'll have our chance," she urged, her eyes scanning the jury for signs of empathy or doubt, reminding him that their fight was also one for the countless voices silenced before him. As the tension crackled in the air, it was evident that the jury was not merely absorbing the evidence laid before them, but were also grappling with the moral implications of the narrative presented. Derek's past, a patchwork of poor decisions and misplaced trust, was a silent character in this courtroom drama. Each juror battled with the notion of guilt and culpability, reflecting on their own experiences, their own lives, and the thin line that often separated right from wrong. They were not just members of a civic duty, but potential judges of a man's fate, their brows furrowed in contemplation. "Mrs. Surrey," Carter interrupted the prosecutor's rhythm with a probing question, her voice cutting through like a beacon of clarity. "Mr. Coleman, can we discuss the circumstances surrounding the evidence collected? Was any of it marked by coercive processes?" This question hung in the air, momentarily softening the tension. She was determined to steer the narrative back toward understanding, to humanize Derek amidst accusations that demanded his dehumanization. Derek could feel his heart racing as the jury's eyes shifted toward Mrs. Carter to Maniristu. In that moment, he found a flicker of hope. Perhaps they could see beyond the surface, the desperation of a young man struggling against the tide of life's adversities. Was it not possible that he had been trying to survive in an unforgiving world? He thought of his mother's sacrifices, the laughter shared with friends, the dreams that felt just within reach before the ground had crumbled beneath him. Then suddenly the sound of a gavel echoed through the room, and Judge Hargrove called for order. "We will take a brief recess," she announced, her tone commanding, yet tinged with an underlying empathy. Derek felt a rush of relief and dread. This brief intermission would allow time for reflection, but it also threatened to deepen the ever-expanding chasm of doubt surrounding him. As people began to rise and murmurs filled the air, Derek caught snippets of conversations, some sympathetic, others laced with judgment. He noticed a woman in the jury's row, her expression softening as she exchanged looks with a fellow juror, perhaps indicating that even in a space charged with animosity, compassion could still bloom. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving Derek to grapple with the raging storm of emotions swirling within him. Would he emerge from this experience as a man defined by his mistakes? Or could the jury see the entirety of his story, one steeped in struggle yet yearning for redemption? The case began with rigorous testimony from law enforcement officers, each of whom took their turn at the witness stand, poised like soldiers in the courtroom's arena. Officer Daniels, a seasoned officer with years of experience under his belt, was one of the first responders at the scene. His deposition was laden with legal terminology that echoed through the room. Phrases like probable cause, reasonable suspicion, and references to exigent circumstances rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. To the untrained ear, it might have sounded impressive, but for Miss Green, it was a different matter entirely. She meticulously prepared to dismantle the carefully constructed facade of his testimony. As she began her cross-examination, the atmosphere shifted. "Was there any corroboration by an independent party?" she pressed, her voice probing the depths of the inconsistencies in his narrative. The tension in the courtroom thickened as the weight of the question hung in the air, amplifying the scrutiny on Officer Daniels. His responses, initially confident, grew increasingly guarded and evasive. The prosecutor's line of questioning was relentless, drawing out doubts about whether due process had truly been followed. With each answer, it became painfully clear to those present that the procedure might have deviated from standard protocol. Ms. Green, skilled in her craft, sought to highlight what many in the community had long suspected, that this wasn't just a case of procedural errors, but a troubling reflection of systemic racial bias that often permeated law enforcement interactions. The defendants in the courtroom held their breath, understanding that what unfolded here was about more than just legalities. It was about a man's life and the pervasive shadows of discrimination that threatened to overshadow justice itself. As Miss Green continued her incisive examination, she noticed Officer Daniel's fingers fidgeting nervously with the edge of his badge, a subtle indication that he was losing his composure. Isn't it true that you had received no direct visual confirmation of any criminal activity before engaging with the suspect? She pressed further, her eyes locked onto his, searching for the crack in his armor. The courtroom, filled with a mix of anxious spectators and determined advocates, seemed to lean in, listening intently for the truth embedded in his responses. The officer cleared his throat, a barely audible sign of his increasing discomfort. I relied on my experience and intuition, he replied, his voice unsteady. Misery. Green seized this moment, a small victory in the battle for justice. But isn't that precisely the issue, she contended? Intuition is susceptible to bias, and it appears your actions stemmed more from a preconceived notion rather than concrete evidence. There was a murmuring in the gallery, an audible acknowledgement that pierced the tension. The spectators began to interact with the unfolding narrative. Some nodded in agreement, while others shook their heads in disbelief. To illuminate the gravity of her argument, Mrs. Green called on an expert witness, Dr. Ramirez, a well-known social psychologist specializing in racial bias and law enforcement practices. Dr. Ramirez took the stand, radiating calm authority. He presented studies on implicit bias, demonstrating how even the most well-intentioned officers could inadvertently allow stereotypes to cloud their judgment. The problem is systemic, he explained. It's not merely individual officers who are to blame, but rather a culture within policing that often perpetuates these disparities. His words rippled across the courtroom, igniting a fire in the hearts of those who had long yearned for change. Green used this momentum to frame her closing argument. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, her voice resolute. This case is a microcosm of a much larger social issue, the intersection of race and justice in our society. When we allow assumptions to dictate actions, we rob not only individuals of their rights, but also tarnish the very fabric of our communal integrity. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Justice must not be a privilege afforded to the few, but a right accessible to all. As she concluded, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted once more. It was electric, filled with the hope of possibility and the longing for fairness. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting the gravity of their task ahead. Outside the courtroom, a crowd had gathered, representing a tapestry of voices united in their demand for accountability. They had watched the proceedings with bated breath, understanding that the outcome could reverberate far beyond the walls of this courthouse, potentially sparking a wave of change in the community and even in the broader legal landscape. As the deliberation began, the room was steeped in silence, the kind that holds its breath in anticipation. The stakes were high, not just for the individual at the heart of the case, but for a society that had long struggled to reconcile the ideals of justice with the reality of discrimination. In that moment, hope coursed through the air like electricity as the echoes of Miss Green's compelling argument lingered, reminding everyone that the pursuit of truth is an unyielding foundation upon which justice must stand. The courtroom was a battleground of legal maneuvering, a site where the principles of justice collided with the harsh realities of societal prejudice. During the preliminary hearing, Miss Green took center stage, arguing with unwavering resolve that the search and seizure conducted by law enforcement were in clear violation of Derrick's Fourth Amendment rights, a cornerstone of American liberty. She delivered her argument with a calm determination that belied the intense stakes at play, confronting not just the procedural errors of the police, but the insidious bias that lurked behind each piece of evidence brought forth by the prosecution. With a voice that resonated through the hushed courtroom, she stated to the jury, "This case is not solely about drug possession. It's about how our justice system has repeatedly devalued the life and dignity of a young black man, branding him as a criminal before he has even had the chance to defend himself." Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the thematic injustice that permeated the entire legal process. They resonated deeply with the few jurors who might have experienced lives touched by the uncertainties of justice in a racially divided society, instilling in them a sense of empathy and urgency that transcended the courtroom's sterile walls. In that moment, Mizzy, Green was not just defending Derek, she was challenging the very institution tasked with upholding fairness and equality, urging the jury to see beyond the accusations and recognize the human being caught in the crosshairs of a flawed system. As Minlas, Green spoke, a flicker of doubt passed through the eyes of some jurors, a moment of reflection that perhaps the images portrayed by the prosecution were shaped by societal prejudices rather than factual representation. She continued, imagine if this were your son, your brother, branded as a criminal for simply existing in a neighborhood where the police believe crime is inevitable. The room held its breath, the tension palpable as she crafted a narrative not only of Derek's alleged crimes, but of his aspirations, his character, and the vibrant life he had led before this moment, stolen from him by the assumptions of others. Kunuaram, Niramatinam, Hin, Din Udas. Moments later, as Derek sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly, he felt the weight of his reality. He had been painted as a statistic, a number in a pointless war on drugs. Yet still he knew he had a story worth telling, one filled with dreams of becoming an engineer, of lifting his family out of the very shackles society seemed intent on keeping them in. Mrs. Green, inspired by Derek's resilience, pressed on, detailing the lack of credible evidence presented by the prosecution, emphasizing how the supposed facts were riddled with inconsistencies, mere constructs of fear rather than truth. After hours of emotionally charged discourse, the courtroom was left reeling. The judge, a stern figure, seemed momentarily softened by the rawness of Mrs. Green's arguments. In moments of sharp clarity, he recognized the impact of the proceedings beyond the confines of his gavel. This was not just a case, it was a bitter reflection of broader societal failings. Outside the courtroom, tension simmered. Activists rallied, holding placards demanding justice for Derek, while supporters and opposition stood divided. Each night, the news outlets took to the airwaves, dissecting the legal battle, framing it alternatively as a quest for justice or merely the defense of a presumed criminal, each spin reflecting the biases that colored public perception. Nazhid Shibri Yerm, there were Nisarminuas, Tarsi 101. Yet in the courtroom, reality was more layered. Conversations began among jurors during deliberations, fortified by personal experiences that molded their perspectives. Some found themselves grappling with their own inherent biases, questioning the narratives they consumed and the way they had previously viewed those who were different from them. The dialogues formed echoes of Moisen, Green's powerful oratory reverberating in their minds. Justice must prevail, but only if we allow ourselves to see the humanity of each individual. As the words "not guilty" broke the silence, a wave of emotion surged through the courtroom. Relief, hope, and the realization that a brighter horizon for equality still flickered like a nascent flame ignited a dialogue that would extend beyond the legal realm into the community's fabric. As the words "not guilty" broke the silence, a wave of emotion coursed through the courtroom. Relief, hope, and the undeniable realization that hope for true equality remained on the horizon flickered like a nascent flame, igniting a dialogue that would extend beyond the legal realm and into the fabric of community, urging a movement towards change that was long overdue. Even as the defense mounted its arguments, the prosecution steadily painted Derek as a product of his environment, crediting his background as a justification for his alleged actions. In a series of remarks that echoed centuries of discrimination, Mr. Coleman insinuated that Derek's involvement in drug possession was almost inevitable given his socioeconomic status. The evidence might show us a pattern, he argued, one that underlines the struggle of those who have been left behind by a society that is unyielding in its pursuit of control. These words, while cloaked in legal jargon, were laced with an unsettling undertone that betrayed a deep-seated disdain for the defendant's race, as if his very existence could be reduced to mere statistics supporting a preconceived narrative. Colleagues in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, some whispering among themselves. recognizing the implications of such biased reasoning. Mr. Coleman seemed to wield his words like weapons, each phrase carefully crafted to evoke sympathy for the system rather than for Derek himself. "Look around," he said, gesturing to the diverse assembly of individuals who had filled the gallery. "What do you see? A reflection of despair, a cycle of violence and crime, and a young man who represents all it. Derek isn't just a name. He's a symptom of something far greater, a failure of a society that has failed to uplift its most vulnerable." His rhetoric struck a nerve, reverberating through the diverse audience, with some nodding in agreement, while others bristled at the implication that Derek was merely a casualty of his circumstances. As witnesses were called to the stand, their testimonies began to unravel layers of hidden realities. A woman in her mid-40s, eyes swollen with unshed tears, shared how the community had changed over the years, how trust had eroded, and how fear now dictated every decision. Her voice trembled, yet it carried the weight of a truth that resonated long before the events of the trial unfolded. The room fell silent, absorbing her lament and the indictment it posed against a system that often turned a blind eye to the marginalization of its citizens. Across the room, Derek sat rigidly, his fate hanging in the balance as he listened to the unfolding saga. His heart pounded not just with anxiety for himself, but with empathy for the stories that echoed around him, reflecting a collective struggle he had long felt but never articulated. He could see the same fear mirrored in the faces of his friends and family, who had come to support him, their expressions a mixture of hope and despair. Meanwhile, the prosecution continued to weave its narrative, expertly portraying Derek not just as an individual, but as a symbol of the failures of an entire generation. Mr. Coleman expertly navigated the legalese, painting a portrait of Derek's life that contrasted sharply against the idyllic images he conjured of the community's supposed standards. The jury, wide-eyed and attentive, started to see what Mr. Coleman wanted them to, a dichotomy between good and evil that had little space for nuance or redemption. But then came the defense's turn. With a calm demeanor and a fierce dedication to justice, Emil Lopez approached the jury with an unshakable belief in Derek's humanity. She laid out the context of his life, the challenges he faced, and the innocent dreams he had. Her words flowed like a gentle river, seeking to wash away the grime of misjudgment and prejudice that surrounded her client. She spoke passionately about the systemic inequalities that often trapped individuals like Derek in a cycle of despair, forcing them into circumstances beyond their control. The courtroom, once a space for division, began to feel like a sanctuary for dialogue, as the opponents' arguments intermingled with empathy. As the trial progressed, waves of emotion surged through the crowd, blurring the lines between spectators and participants in the quest for truth. Conversations erupted outside the courthouse among activists and advocates who held vivid signs, their voices joining in a chorus that challenged a status quo which so readily discarded the complexities of human lives. This trial had become a referendum on not just Derek's fate, but also the very fabric of their society. In this tumultuous atmosphere, Derek found unexpected strength. He realized that his story was part of a larger narrative, one that demanded acknowledgement and change. As he sat at the defendant's table, he understood that whatever the jury's decision, his voice would echo far beyond these walls. In a system that often sought to silence those in his position, his unresolved battle could become the catalyst for a future rooted in justice, equality, and understanding. With each passing moment, Derek felt the weight of countless stories resting on his shoulders. The faces of those who had come before him flickered in his mind, a gauntlet of despair and resilience. It was as if he could hear their whispers, urging him to stand firmly in his truth. The stakes were high, and the gravity of the moment sent ripples of anticipation through the crowded courtroom. The jurors, an eclectic mix of backgrounds and experiences, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps beginning to comprehend the profound implications of their verdict. Derek pondered the roads they had traveled to arrive at this juncture. Some may have arrived with preconceived notions, yet he hoped the raw authenticity of his testimony would pierce through the barriers of bias and prejudice. As the judge called for order, Derek took a deep breath, his resolute spirit illuminating the space around him. He envisioned a future where young voices wouldn't have to navigate the same treacherous terrain he had. Schools, he imagined, where education would not be hindered by socioeconomic disparities, but rather fostered a culture of inclusivity and mutual respect. He thought about the legal system, too. Derek was aware that changing legislation was a daunting task, but it felt like a necessary crusade for him and many others whose lives were impacted by unjust laws. He envisioned advocacy groups rallying alongside him, fighting tirelessly to end the cycles of oppression and inequality. A coalition built on the belief that every individual deserved a fair chance at justice. It was about creating a society where every person, irrespective of their background or circumstance, would feel empowered to uncover their voice, much like he had done, advocating for reform that recognized the dignity and humanity of all. As he spoke, his words transformed into a melody of hope. Derek understood that his battle was not solely his own. It was a collective march toward a brighter, more equitable tomorrow. He closed his eyes for just a moment, immersing himself in the thought of progress. A world where children of every background would walk hand in hand, free from the shackles of discrimination. When he finally opened his eyes, the potential for change was unmistakable in the air. The very walls of the courtroom seemed to pulse with a new energy. No longer was this a space of mere judgment. It had become a sanctuary for truth, a stage for healing. In that defining moment, Derek pledged to not only fight for his own justice, but also to advocate for those who felt powerless in a world designed to erase their stories. And with that determination soaring through him, Derek stood tall, ready to face the outcome, knowing that every story shared, every voice amplified, could indeed be the spark igniting a revolution of empathy and understanding. The trial then ventured into the murky waters of testimonial evidence. Several witnesses took the stand. One such witness, Mr. Carter, a neighbor from Derek's dormitory, provided character testimony, describing Derek as a gentle man, a student with dreams of becoming a community organizer. He recalled how Derek often spoke passionately about social justice and racial equality. He was always working on something to help others, Mr. Carter recalled, his voice tinged with sorrow. However, his testimony was quickly undermined by the prosecution's emphasis on circumstantial evidence and unverified claims of illicit behavior. In one of the more poignant moments of the trial, Derek's own narrative was brought to light during his testimony. Although hesitant and visibly nervous, he spoke not only of the events leading up to his arrest, but also of the larger issues that permeated his daily life and shaped his identity. "I believe in the law," Derek stated, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. "But I also believe that the law has failed people like me time and again. Each day I witness how the system is stacked against individuals from my community, how poverty and discrimination create barriers that feel insurmountable. I have done nothing more than attempt to better myself and contribute to the community, whether through mentorship for local youth or volunteering at soup kitchens. And yet here I stand, defined solely by these charges, stripped of my humanity and the progress I've made. My dreams, my aspirations are overshadowed by a narrative that portrays me as a criminal before I've had a chance to show who I really am." His words cut through the courtroom like a knife, reverberating with the raw injustice of a system that seemed designed not only to punish, but to perpetuate a cycle of oppression, exposing the deep-seated biases that often dictate the lives of those marginalized by society. The defense's cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses revealed a persistent pattern. The evidence against Derek was largely circumstantial, and the testimony relied heavily on assumptions reinforced by racial stereotypes. During one intense session, Ms. Green questioned an undercover officer who had participated in the operation. "Is it not true," she asked, directing her inquiry with calculated precision, "that in the midst of confusion during the operation, your focus was as much on the suspect's appearance as on the behavior that warranted a search?" The officer hesitated, and though he managed to offer a scripted response, the damage was done. The jury began to murmur among themselves, some faces reflecting the conflict between their understanding of justice and the narrative being offered before them. The courtroom's tone grew more somber as the defense introduced expert testimony regarding biased policing practices and the historical context of drug laws. Evelyn Carter, a well-respected sociologist, took the stand to discuss the phenomenon of racial profiling and its devastating impact on communities of color. "Empirical data shows," she explained with measured clarity, "that African American communities are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement for drug-related offenses. The language used in prior cases, the deployment of certain policies reminiscent of the war on drugs, All these factors contribute to systemic biases that cannot be ignored. Her testimony added a vital perspective, one that firmly anchored the proceedings in a broader societal context. Throughout the trial, Judge Harrington maintained an air of strict procedural control. However, his rulings often seemed to favor the prosecution. Motions filed by Ms. Hickson Green to suppress evidence on the grounds of unlawful search were summarily denied. The court cannot disregard evidence that has been properly obtained, he argued, invoking the doctrine of good faith under which the actions of law enforcement were deemed acceptable. This legal rationale, though technically accurate, cast a long shadow over any attempt by the defense to claim that Derek's constitutional rights had been violated. The defense filed several motions, each met with procedural rejections that deepened the sense of fatalism surrounding Derek's trial. Outside the courtroom, the media landscape had shifted dramatically as reporters zealously documented the trial, often framing Derek as a cautionary tale rather than acknowledging him as a victim of a deeply flawed justice system. Headlines splashed across news outlets seemed designed to evoke a narrative of guilt, overshadowing the complexities of his situation and the evidence that suggested his innocence. Meanwhile, social media surged with a flurry of activity, hashtags like Justice for Derek and End Racial Bias trending as supporters rallied online. These digital platforms became a crucible for debate, where many decried the evident racial prejudices that permeated the proceedings, while others echoed the voices of those who uphold the status quo. For countless individuals in the community, the trial transformed into a powerful symbol of the broader struggle against a justice system long accused of operating in defiance of equality and fairness. Activists and concerned citizens rallied behind Derek, organizing peaceful protests that brought together people from different walks of life, all united by a common cause. They arranged educational seminars aimed at illuminating the historical injustices that have shaped the judicial landscape, offering vital context to contemporary issues. Stories of past victims of systemic failure were shared, and discussions about reform flourished, fostering a regenerative spirit within the community. These actions, though noble and filled with hope, bore a stark contrast to the solemn atmosphere within the courtroom's four walls, where legal battles were fought under the weight of unfathomable stakes. The reality of the trial seemed a world apart from the aspirations and resolve of those outside, emphasizing the profound disconnect between the judicial process and the voices demanding justice. Mists. Green's counterargument was a deliberate, impassioned appeal to the principles of justice and equality. We are here today not merely to decide a verdict, but to confront a systemic issue that has denied justice to countless individuals, she implored. Derek Jackson's story is not an isolated incident, but a reflection of a justice system that too often overlooks racial discrimination. I urge you, members of the jury, to set aside preconceived notions and focus solely on the facts, keeping in mind the broader context of how our laws are enforced. Let us not allow history to repeat itself by letting the bias of past eras dictate the fate of an individual in our modern society. Her plea resonated as a call to see beyond fabrications of character and concentrate on the case's legal merits. Mrs. Green's counterargument was a deliberate and impassioned appeal to the principles of justice and equality. We are here today not merely to decide a verdict, but to confront a systemic issue that has denied justice to countless individuals, she implored. Derek Jackson's story is not an isolated incident, but a reflection of a justice system that too often looks the other way when it comes to racial discrimination. I ask you, members of the jury, to set aside any preconceived notions and to look solely at the facts, keeping in mind the broader context of how our laws are enforced. Let us not allow history to repeat itself, allowing the bias of past eras to determine the fate of an individual in our modern society. Her plea was earnest, a call to see beyond the fabrications of character and focus on the legal merits, or lack thereof, of the case against Derek. The jury retired to deliberate with heavy hearts and minds weighed down by the enormity of their decision. In the confines of the deliberation room, each juror wrestled with the evidence. Some questioned whether the procedural rules that allowed the evidence to be admitted, even if obtained in a manner that smacked of racial profiling, truly served the cause of justice. Others were compelled by the strict letter of the law, unable to extricate their judgments from the traditional interpretations that had governed the courtroom for decades. Hours turned into a long, drawn-out session of introspection until finally the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom hushed as the foreperson, a middle-aged white woman with tired eyes, delivered the decision. "We find the defendant guilty of drug possession," she stated, her voice measured but carrying a weight that seemed to settle on everyone present. There was no pause for emotion, no moment of empathetic silence for the life that could have been. Instead, the words etched themselves in the minds of all, marking the end of a trial that had far-reaching implications beyond the individual on trial. As Judge Harrington pronounced the sentence, the language was precise yet devoid of the human element. In accordance with the sentencing guidelines and considering all evidence presented, the defendant is hereby sentenced to 2 years in a correctional facility for drug possession. This court finds that the rules and procedures of law have been adhered to, and no mitigating circumstances sufficient to warrant leniency have been established. His words rang like a verdict written in stone, reaffirming a system that had long been criticized for perpetuating inequality. The gavel struck the desk, and with it, the sound of hope for Derek's future dissipated into echoes down the corridor of history. Derek's family and friends gathered in the courthouse lobby, exchanged tearful glances and whispered promises of relentless advocacy. His mother, a resilient woman who had long battled for social justice, vowed to fight on. "This is not the end," she whispered into the camera of a local news outlet. "Our fight is just beginning, and we will use every legal means available to ensure that Derek's voice is heard." Her words, filled with unyielding determination, resounded with a promise that the struggle for equality was far from over. In the weeks that followed, Derek's case became a catalyst for broader discussions on the systemic failings of the justice system. Legal scholars, community organizers, and human rights advocates cited the case as illustrative of the implicit bias inherent in legal proceedings, where the race of the defendant plays an undeniable role. Panel discussions in university lecture halls echoed with debates on the term institutional racism and its implications for modern jurisprudence. Books and scholarly articles were written, each dissecting the trial and its outcome to illustrate how structural prejudice continues to influence the lives of those who are marginalized. Mr. Nibberwis, Green continued to represent Derek on appeal, arguing that the trial was marred by numerous legal deficiencies. In her brief to the appellate court, she meticulously outlined the improper admission of evidence, the lack of a fair hearing on motions intended to protect the defendant's constitutional rights, and the broader context of racially charged practices within the jurisdiction. She cited landmark cases, comparing them to Derek's situation, and argued passionately that his conviction was not a product of impartial justice, but rather of an entrenched system that prioritized punitive measures over fairness. In deposition after deposition, it became evident that Derek's life had been an enduring struggle against preconceived notions imposed by society. As a scholar, he had once written essays on the importance of equitable treatment under the law, unaware that he would soon be a living testament to the pitfalls of a system steeped in historical inequality. His personal journals, later uncovered during the discovery process, revealed a thoughtful, introspective young man who grappled with the contradictions of pursuing academic excellence while navigating the racially charged environment of law enforcement. Even within the confines of the correctional facility where he was ultimately incarcerated, Derek found solace in the act of writing. His reflections poured out onto the pages, woven together with threads of both bitterness and glimmers of hope. This hope was not just an anchor for his own spirit, but also a beacon illuminating a broader fight for justice, a fight he aspired to galvanize with his words. "Every day I sit here," he penned in one poignant journal entry, "I remember that I am more than just a statistic, a mere number in a system that often overlooks the humanity of the individuals it claims to serve. I was a son, a student, and a dreamer, molded by my experiences and aspirations. While the world sees me as guilty, I know in my heart that I am a symbol of a fight for justice that will continue long after I am gone." His writings were not merely an outlet, they became a manifesto, a declaration of his intent to challenge the status quo and inspire others to rise against the injustices that plague their communities. Derek envisioned a future where his story, and the stories of many like him, would inspire a collective reckoning, sparking change and fostering understanding in a world too often divided by race and circumstance. Even within the confines of the correctional facility where he was ultimately incarcerated, Derek found solace in the act of writing. He began to connect with others in the facility, forming bonds over shared experiences and collectively grieving the lost opportunities and the futures they once envisioned. Through book clubs and writing workshops initiated by a compassionate volunteer, Derek became a mentor to those around him, guiding them to articulate their own stories. Writing is our weapon, he would tell them, the tool we use to carve out our existence in a world that conspires to erase us. His words encouraged fellow inmates to look at their lives through a new lens, spurring them to craft their narratives of resilience and redemption. Meanwhile, Derek started envisioning a wider audience for his message. He dreamed of publishing a collection of his writings, hoping to reach not only those behind bars, but also the broader society that had deemed them unworthy of empathy. If only they could see us as we truly are, he wrote fervently, as men and women capable of change, still dreaming despite the odds stacked against us. He believed that sharing these stories would dismantle the stigmas associated with incarceration and foster a deeper understanding of the factors that led people to their fateful crossroads. With each passing day, his resolve to advocate for systemic change grew stronger. Derek began writing letters to local lawmakers and engaging in discussions about prison reform, advocating for educational programs within correctional facilities that could provide inmates with the tools they needed to reintegrate into society successfully. His once solitary battle transformed into a collective movement. Derek knew he didn't have to fight alone. He was part of a larger tapestry of voices, all echoing the same plea for justice and dignity. "We are not the mistakes we've made," he wrote, "but the promises of who we can still become." As he reached the final pages of his journal, Derek felt a surge of renewed purpose. He was ready to challenge the world outside those gray walls, armed with the insights he had garnered during his time of reflection. He envisioned not an end, but a beginning, a movement fueled by stories, a call to action ignited by the truths he and his comrades would share. In those moments, writing became his lifeline, a compass guiding him toward freedom, not just in a physical sense, but freedom of the spirit, a freedom that would resonate long after the last word was penned. The ripple effects of Derek's trial were felt far beyond the courthouse. Civil rights organizations leveraged his case to campaign for comprehensive reforms in evidence-gathering protocols and the reduction of racial bias in prosecution. Lawmakers, pressured by public opinion and the efforts of dedicated activists, began drafting legislation aimed at increasing accountability in policing and ensuring that every citizen could expect an unbiased legal trial. Community leaders organized town hall meetings, urging local governments to invest in training programs that highlighted the dangers of implicit bias and the importance of upholding civil liberties. As appeals were filed and review hearings arranged, the saga of Derek Jackson became emblematic of a broader struggle within contemporary American society. The trial had laid bare the systemic issues that continue to plague the justice system, forcing a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about race, power, and structural inequality that could not be ignored any longer. The legal community was split. Some held firm to the notion that the law, as applied, was neutral and impartial, while others saw Derek's case as a glaring example of a system that required deep structural change, an urgent reminder of the need for ongoing reform. Months later, in a packed appellate court, the panel of judges, now more diverse in composition than Derek's original jury, revisited the case. In a lengthy opinion that spanned over 100 pages, the appellate judges acknowledged that while there was no definitive evidence of intentional racial discrimination in the procedural aspects of the trial, there were undeniable patterns that pointed to a systemic issue. They remanded the case for reconsideration of the evidence that had been deemed admissible and ordered a series of reviews into the investigative methods employed by the police department involved. For Derek and his family, the appellate decision was a bittersweet victory. It was an acknowledgement that their struggle had not been in vain, even though it fell short of overturning the conviction entirely. The decision, while not fully exonerating him, symbolized an institutional opening for reform, an opportunity to re-examine practices that had long been accepted without question. In the dim light of his correctional cell, Derek found solace in his writing and memory. He recalled the days when he walked the campus with the light of hope in his eyes, only to have that hope dimmed by the oppressive weight of injustice. He dreamed of a day when the color of one's skin would no longer predetermine the course of justice, when the law would not be weaponized against those who sought merely to better themselves. The story of Derek Jackson is one that continues to reverberate through the halls of academia, legal institutions, and community centers. It is a story of a young man caught in a web of systemic racism, whose fate was sealed by legal technicalities and centuries-old prejudices. Yet it is also a story of resilience, a battle cry for the marginalized, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming injustice, the human spirit endures, and the call for equitable reform can never be silenced, urging all who hear it to reflect on their role in the tapestry of societal change. As observers of this trial and its aftermath, we are compelled to question the true nature of justice in a society that so often fails to live up to its ideals. Derek Jackson's trial remains a testament to the enduring struggle for an impartial legal system, a struggle that demands ongoing vigilance, compassion, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. In the echo of his final words and in the reverberations of the court's gavel lies the unyielding truth that justice, when distorted by systemic prejudice, is a call to action for all who care about the future of our society. In time, as lessons are learned and reforms gradually take root, the hope endures that the story of Derek Jackson will not be one of defeat, but a pivotal moment in the long march toward a truly fair and unbiased justice system. Thus, the trial of Derek stands as both a somber reminder of our past shortcomings and a beacon for the reforms of tomorrow. It challenges us to look within our legal institutions and our collective conscience, to recognize and dismantle the systemic barriers that continue to inhibit true justice. And in doing so, it offers a glimmer of hope that one day every courtroom will echo with the promise of equality, and every verdict will be rendered not by the color of a person's skin, but solely on the merit of the evidence and the unwavering pursuit of justice. In the hushed corridors of memory and in the fervent debates within academic and legal circles alike, the legacy of Derek Jackson endures. It lives on in the impassioned pleas of civil rights advocates, in the determined marches of protesters, and in the reflective eyes of future legal practitioners committed to the cause of equity. His story remains a cautionary tale, a reminder of how far we have come and how far we still must go to achieve the justice that is rightfully due to every human being.